Hi, morning everyone. Just gonna give it a moment or two to let others join, get in. There's a couple in the waiting room I see. Uh, we usually get going by about 4 minutes past. So I'm just gonna give it a moment or two, and then we'll get going. So welcome. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday morning. We've been doing this for the past, I'd say 2 months, 2.5 months, every alternate weekend on a Saturday, not for too long. Thankfully, so far we've been keeping it to time, at least ending on time, even if we don't start slap bang at 10 o'clock when we said we would. But we generally just give it a minute or two for others to join. Well, good morning, everyone. I think we should get going. We're at 3 minutes past 10. We generally do give it a minute or so after 10 o'clock, but I think we are going to get going. We seem to have a reasonable set of numbers in terms of participants. So let's get going because we generally do try to finish, as I say, on time, and we more or less try to start on time. So with it gone now 4 minutes past, let's get into it. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday morning. Thanks again to Defend Our Democracy for hosting this series, and thanks John especially for leading the seminar series. I am just here as a interlocutor, as a facilitator generally. I sometimes pose a couple questions of my own. I abuse my position as the facilitator, but rest assured, everyone does get a chance to talk. There's a space in the chat. We do monitor the chat, and the chat questions are filtered through. We obviously do give people a chance to participate. So just by way of a few housekeeping things, we try to keep everyone muted, not because we don't want participation, but simply because we want to minimize the background noise and interference that can potentially sometimes happen. So that's the reason. Please feel free to make comments in the chat. Lift your hand if you want to say something. We generally do recognize someone if they want to say something. You will be given a chance to speak when you raise your hand and so on. We try to keep the video off, certainly just for bandwidth purposes. John and I will from time to time keep ours on, just so you can see that we're here, and John especially because he's obviously leading the seminar. But when you are going to say something or you are going to speak and you are recognized to do so, please switch on and one of the assistants will help you to unmute or will unmute you so you can say something. So please, we do encourage participation. And with that, thanks again for joining us. Thanks, DoD, for hosting the series, and thanks, John, for leading it. As you know, today's theme, today's topic is sequencing reforms in justice and security. So we're looking at the criminal justice cluster. Some friend of mine quipped at some stage that if you're talking about it from the perspective of citizens, you might want to call it criminal injustice cluster. And if you talk about it from the perspective of potential suspects, then you can call it the criminal justice cluster because that's how it appears to work. It's injustice for some and justice for others. And that we know doesn't make for a good society in which there is a consistent, predictable set of legitimate underpinnings to the public perceptions about the criminal justice cluster. We, as you know, have been running this series with Defend Our Democracy for a series of 7 so far. The general overarching theme is about the relationship between democracy and development, and democratic government, and how democratic government needs to sequence policy changes for more effective transformation, distribution, redistribution, social development, and so on, and particularly with a focus on economic development. All of the recordings of the previous seminars are available online. You will get them. And just by way of brief introduction before we go on and hand over to John, John has been leading the seminar series. He is, as some of you might well know, and those of you who've been attending know that he's a seasoned senior journalist and has been an editor of papers at some stage, has worked internationally for the United Nations, and spent a fair amount of time at the University of Chicago in the US on a fellowship studying developmental states, looking at how certain societies developed. One of the things that is not that widely known, but is certainly noteworthy, is the fact that John helped President Mandela prepare himself for dealing with the public and the media once he was released from prison. And in addition to that, has published several books, including the most recent one called Cyril's Choices, which does deal with the kind of policy reforms that John has suggested are required to fast track development or to sequence the set of political and policy changes which are required. So with that brief introduction, John, over to you, and thanks again. You're muted, John.
Okay, there we are. Thank you, Ibrahim, and good morning, everyone. Right, so today we're talking about sequencing reforms in justice and security. The key to successful government reform is to have a laser focus on the core outcome you want. Because what you find when you get into government is that everyone adds things. They turn it into a Christmas tree. Whatever you start with an original idea, and then you add things, and the consequences are unintended, where other things than the core issue get the focus. So I want to start with a quote from, retired Justice Edwin Cameron, because I think it goes to the core focus of criminal justice reform. Edwin Cameron said, "The major response to the crime wave in the country should be to recognize that the sole inhibiting institutional response to criminal conduct is the certainty of detection, the certainty of follow-up, the certainty of arraignment, the certainty of prosecution, and the certainty of punishment. In the certainty, the length of sentence plays no role. In other words, whether a potential rapist faces a sentence of 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or life, it's not the length of the sentence that puts him off, but the certainty of sentencing that will make them stop. The blunt point is this," says Cameron, "we do no good at all by finding and prosecuting a haphazardly small segment of rapists and murderers and sentencing them to life imprisonment, jamming our prisons because we have a minimum sentence requirement. What possible point is there to this in a country with 21,000 murders a year and reportedly over 41,000 rapes a year? Minimum sentences merely divert us from understanding what we should do. So it's not about bringing back the death penalty or minimum sentences. We either bring criminals to trial and convict them and sentence them, or we fail. There is no third option." So I think we can put up on the screen the outline of today's talk. I'm going to look at 6 main themes, and there are 1 or 2 that have come in as well. First, the State Security Agency and the new draft intelligence book. Secondly, the National Prosecuting Authority. thirdly, the SAPS, the South African Police Services, then the Hawks, then the VIP Protection Service, the Blue Light Brigade, and then the reforms that have come about where the private sector has been brought in, and also the requests of provincial governments to play a bigger role in the criminal justice system. And the reality is we all feel increasingly unsafe and frustrated because we're not getting the service we expect from the criminal justice system. If you watch cases of day-to-day crime or the AKA murder trial or other profile trials, too often we can see the system isn't working properly, and fixing it will take courageous reforms. The lack of successful high-profile state capture prosecutions is also particularly disturbing. There were two especially important cases, the two biggest high-profile ones. First was the Vrede Dairy Farm in the Free State. This project, you'll recall, was supposed to provide poor farmers with a dairy farm and income and a career, but instead the money the government paid was siphoned off to the Guptas and was used to pay for that famous Gupta wedding at Sun City. When it came to court, it was known as the Nalani case. And last year, the judge dismissed the case on the grounds that the prosecutors had failed to provide enough evidence to convict. The judge said there was no doubt at least 25 million rand in government money went missing, but without sufficient evidence, she had no alternative to throw the case out. This was a failure of the prosecutors. The other high-profile state capture case was against the former CEO of Eskom, Machela Koko. This one was struck off the roll on the grounds that there were unreasonable delays. Again, the prosecutors were held responsible. So the high-level criminals whose names are well known to us continue to walk free, and we as citizens don't feel safe. So where does the problem lie? Well, the government's come with its latest reform, a draft of new legislation to fix one piece of the criminal justice system, the State Security Agency. We know about the SSA's recent failures. They could hardly have been more high profile. The SSA was not prepared for the wave of unrest in KwaZulu-Natal in 2021, around the time of Zuma's arrest. And they left something like 300 people dead. And the other, of course, high-profile case was when Parliament was burned down because it was unprotected. These are such major failings that they should alone spark an outcry. But in fact, the Mufamadi, not only the Zondo Commission, but a special high-level panel on SSA, the Mufamadi high-level panel, led by Sidney Mufamadi, who's now the National Security Advisor to the President, so very, very senior, reported on their report on intelligence and investigated the SSA and warned us. The report complained that the SSA's role had deviated to interference in domestic politics, that the minister had accumulated too much power and abused it, and called for sweeping reforms to curtail this abuse and return it to its core functions of providing intelligence to protect national security. If you want more on the high-level panel report, you can Google it and get the whole report online and read it, or you can read. I have a chapter on it in Cyril's Choices in my book. If you have time and interest to look at that. After a delay of several years, we get this General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill. That was late last year, but it's not a coherent response to the report. It's not an evidence-based solution, it's something else. This amendment increases the minister's power. It creates a whole framework for potential abuses, including requiring intelligence vetting of NGOs and religious organizations. These are the actions common to repressive states. So you wonder where it came from. Then it defines national security in the most broad and strange terms. It says national security are the measures, activities, and the capability of the state to pursue and advance any opportunity or potential opportunity and the security of the Republic and its people, including national interests and national values. I've never seen that on a national security document before. That national interests and national values, that's so broad, could take in almost everything and almost seems to invite a return to political interference. The SSA has no business solving social problems. At least one member of the high-level panel has already criticized the bill publicly. So other critics, it's widely criticized, but people try to understand, how did we get to this? How is it possible that the bill goes counter to the recommendations of the report it was designed to address? It will instill fear into the NGOs and religious organizations and create a less effective intelligence agency with potential for abuse. Clearly some interests in the existing system put it there. Yet nobody in authority was willing or able to stop it. So clearly we have to think differently to turn South Africa around in the criminal justice system at this instance. We have to think about how we take on reforms, and we have to think about sequencing reforms, because there will be political blowback to something, because whoever put the ideas in the bill is still there. Some reforms may be obvious, but have to wait because they'll be disruptive, and those vested interests can kibosh change. In other cases, delay is fatal because those vested interests will sabotage all reform. So now I want to talk specifically about what you do about the SSA. I've been talking to senior figures in the Zondo Commission and elsewhere. I believe the SSA is such a high risk that many are arguing for it to be closed down and restart the building of intelligence from scratch with a different culture. They argue that it's so compromised that the bad more than outweighs any good it does. It failed to identify those two major security disasters we had in the last few years, and it has capacity to sabotage real reform. If we're going to get a coalition government after these elections, you may have to do it by a prior coalition agreement on the first day, because otherwise, as a matter of plain politics, it may become impossible to do it later. So obviously that means the legislation before Parliament needs to be rethought in the spirit of the recommendations that inspired it. The problem was too much power with too loose mandate and oversight, so this doesn't solve it. A new intelligence service needs to be established from the ground up based on constitutional guidelines and national security requirements with no political role and a different institutional culture. So the second issue is the National Prosecuting Authority. Now, when the new I've talked about its high-profile failings. When the new director of the NPA took office, she promised to start things like an innovation hub and a training sector. I talked to judges and senior counsel at the time, and they expected it would fail. Because the key to training is on-the-job training under top-rate lawyers in charge of individual prosecutions, to try to understand why the NPA continues to fail. I've talked to prosecutors and consultants, and this is my conclusion. The NPA has both the problem of state capture era staff still there, and among the new prosecutors, a lack of confidence that they can manage these big cases, often with very complicated financial forensics. To fix this, I hear almost a consensus outside of the system, that they will have to hire outside senior counsels and attorneys and have them lead prosecutions, while obviously training less experienced NPA staff on the job. Lawyers have offered pro bono support, but there's been strong resistance inside the NPA. This resistance to recruiting private sector advocates and attorneys must end. The Zondo Commission demonstrated their value. All the evidence leaders were from the private sector. They're going to be essential to conduct efficient, speedy, effective prosecutions and restore damaged public faith in the system. They must mentor less experienced lawyers on their teams as they prosecute high-profile crimes on the job. On-the-job training is the most important form of training by far. All that matters, as Justice Cameron pointed out, is convictions and sentences. There is no second prize. Now, the third item is the South African Police Service, SAPS. Now, the most useful fact I learned while investigating police reform was this. South Africa has skilled senior police officers, black and white, with the first-rate skills, but who are not being given the top jobs. Some are still in the SAPS. I was told about one black general who has a doctorate and is very competent, because obviously degrees alone don't tell you enough about someone's expertise. But others have retired. We need a police minister who's not afraid to hire forceful, independent-minded professionals who are not political. A new police minister needs to be sufficiently familiar with the senior police hierarchy to make these changes on entry office. Analysts familiar with the senior police know far more qualified senior police, both still in the piece and outside. So that's where we are. I mean, if you don't do that, don't expect an improvement. Okay, fourth topic. What is wrong with the Hawks? I'm sorry if what I'm telling you all comes across as depressing, but these are the facts. And the good news is we have the resources to fix it. What's missing is the political will. So the Hawks replaced the Scorpions in 2008. The first year of the Hawks showed an 85% decline in new investigations compared to the Scorpions. And the value of assets seized fell by 99%. By the way, I'm drawing this from Paul Hoffman's book, Under the Swinging Arch. He edited it. And this book is by Paul and other lawyers who were involved in the cases that forced the case before the Constitutional Court and got the judgment that the Hawks do not meet the constitutional mandate. So arrests fell from 14,700 in 2010-11 to 5,800 in 2014-15. These figures are so extreme, they decisively show that change was not a change from Scorpions, in fact, just to the opposite. So the next top priority item is the creation of an independent, multidisciplinary, Scorpion-style properly funded high-priority crimes unit to replace the Hawks. Its mandate should include high-level corruption, commercial crime, organized crime, and it needs to be constitutionally protected from interference. And the criteria that were laid down by the constitutional note have been become known as the STIRS criteria, which stands for specialized, trained, independent, resourced, and secure in tenure of office. Now, Paul Hoffman of Accountability Now has been championing this because since the Scorpions were so easily disbanded, support for entrenching the new body in the Constitution as a Chapter 9 body has gained ground, because then its independence would be constitutionally protected. The DA has submitted a private member's bill to propose this. Of course, that would require a constitutional amendment supported by 2/3 of the National Assembly and 6 of the 9 provinces in the NCOP. The ANC has not come on board, although there are some who I think may support it. So we'll see what happens. Now, the next thing is, obviously, this body needs a far bigger budget than the Hawks have. And this slide should show you that. If you can put up the budget slide I sent you. If you look at this slide, the Blue Light Brigade, the BIP protection unit, has a budget of 3.76 billion rand. Effectively, they mainly support 200. They protect 200 young. Yet the Hawks, which has to protect 60 million South Africans against priority crimes of a wide range, they have a 2.2 billion rand budget. That's about 60% of the Blue Light Brigade. This budget is obviously not based on this budget comparison is obviously not based on what the nation really needs. So I'm now moving on to the BIP protection unit. You'll remember the video of the violence on civilians on a highway, and then also, of course, the Warsaw airport incident, where the Polish government stopped a plane taking 100 security members of the presidential guard, a guarding team, and quite a lot of arms. When you go to conferences in the corridors, diplomats and academics keep asking South Africans, what's the explanation? Why did they have so many weapons? Why did they have so many people? An ambassador of a country much richer than ours told me the normal they use for the head of government is 4 people, because the head of state's protection is the responsibility of the host government. The visiting principal's own guards are therefore liaison in personal emergencies. We had 100. So they ask, why did we have so many weapons? And their imaginations go a bit wild. Were we bringing samples of weapons to sell arms to the Russians? I doubt it. I don't think that's the realistic reason. But the numbers, what explains it? I fear that it's another case of elite pampering, another case where too many people are sent because they want to go, like the idea, but it's really not necessary and it's not appropriate, because when you spend money on the wrong things, you fail to spend money on the right things. Now, I'm just going to highlight a few other different areas. The Independent Police Investigation Department, IPID, needs to be made independent of the Police Commission and prioritize investigating top-level police to bring them to justice. Now, you know that there was a case where the clearance of an IPID, the head of IPID, was removed. Obviously, this looked like political interference. Okay, the next is the justice system itself. Almost every corner of its vast bureaucracy needs to be vitalized. We know that court buildings are in advanced disrepair. You won't see it at the Constitutional Court, of course, which is still a sort of model building, and tourists are taken around there. But the disrepair in the other courts is quite extreme. And what it means is that the relation, what I found when I looked into why the buildings aren't being repaired, it turns out the relationship between the judiciary and the public works department has somewhat broken down. This is sometimes called the problem of silos in government. Practices have arisen that prohibit direct interaction between departments without going through sometimes obstructionist ministers. or Directors General. The Supreme Court of Appeals Judge President needed a bucket to stop the water dripping through the roof leaks in her office. A Potchefstroom court roof recently collapsed. Many courts sit for more than an hour a day, little more than an hour a day, which means discipline and authority have broken down. Judgments routinely take a year or more to be handed down, which means the Judicial Services Commission lacks diligence. I want to put up the graph, if you don't mind. What this shows is how the priority of budget spending has shifted from building, repair, and so on to personnel costs. And you see that if you've been to some of the earlier webinars, this is a standard trend. Personnel costs have risen as a percentage of the total budget enormously. And obviously there's a link. If more money goes into personnel, percentage-wise, it's not 70, 80%, obviously less goes into protecting the building. And what you're finding is a lack of pride in our system, in our buildings, in our whole justice edifice. And this, and I don't know how our politicians can let this continue. It's got to be changed. How's our time? Yeah, it's okay. Now, another thing I've noticed, when I was a journalist in the apartheid era, I remember noticing that the police, when there was a high-profile crime, the apartheid era police would announce a flurry of arrests, 8 people arrested. And of course, that satisfied the media until they went on to something else and the public stopped thinking about it. And then they were quietly released or failed to be prosecuted. Now, I've seen some of the same signs today. Remember, all that matters is successful prosecutions of the guilty. So when you put all this together, the range of fixes needed is extensive. The backlog of cases must be eliminated. Victims need better support, so do whistleblowers. And this is going to get worse over the next 5 years if we don't step in decisively. The fabric of the institutions, the pipeline of detectives, prosecutors, interpreters, specialist senior officers, been so disrupted that the loss of skills portends an even worse picture in the future. Right now, the skills still exist in South Africa to meet the challenge, but we need to use it, otherwise it'll be too late. And of course, the other thing about the structure of the police, we need to prioritize specialist police units. We need a specialist unit to resolve the problem of criminality at Eskom. We need this to beef up gender-based violence work through a specialist organization. For instance, I mean, if you think about it, a decisive government would move to contain the crime at the limited number of electricity plants where extensive criminal activity is compromising the country's economy and its citizens' livelihoods. This should be a top priority, obviously. Then we need, for instance, crime statistics needs to be independent of the police. Stats SA might be the simplest place to do that. A suggestion is made that a percentage of cash recovered should go to investigative journalism because it's the branch of society that has been most effective in enduring and uncovering malfeasance. Of course, I, as a journalist, wouldn't oppose that. Police use of new technology needs to be upgraded urgently. There's insufficient up-to-date use of drones, dash cams, body cams, shot detection, audio technology, and CCTV cameras to cut crime activity on the streets. AI, artificial intelligence, is also a game changer in anticipating crime. Now, the sixth topic I want to go to is the private sector a growing role in the justice system, and also the request for devolution of power of the police and so on to the cities and provinces. As you will know, last year, business did a deal and reached an agreement with government. And the agreement was that business was mandated to bring expertise to how many areas? Four crime areas. The first was to help to capacitate the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority. The second was to build a state-of-the-art forensics department. The third was to pool private sector intelligence, including from the Minerals Council and the Banking Association, that rendered specialized services. And the fourth was to help the police to capacitate and train staff at call centers and police stations. Now, on the third one of private sector intelligence, if you read the report that was done on the violence in KwaZulu-Natal in 2021, it was actually surprisingly positive about the commercial security companies, although it made a distinction. Those that were registered and part of associations played a really key role, and in areas where the police fell down. But they also said that there are rogue security companies who are not benign actors in the same way at all. So obviously this is a short-term solution, but it's also necessary to think about why we're using the private sector to do these things. It's not because government has an ideological belief in the private sector, quite the reverse. It's a result of need. It's clearly because we recognize that the criminal justice system isn't working and the private sector works relatively better, and so we're taking their help. But clearly we need a long-term view about the private sector takeover of key police functions. Is this what we want for the long term? I would argue not, because the incentives of the private sector are different from the public interest. I mean, sometimes they're the same, but they're not always the same. That's why we have a state. So then, of course, the alternative pressure is for provincial and municipal governments to devolve some policing powers to them. I would say that once the private sector has helped restore policing to proper functionality, ideally the private sector should get out. It's not an ideal situation, and this should go back to government. So then the question is, can the national government do it all on its own? Given the enormous task
of celebration of the national leader and the resilience that she displayed, but it's also
okay, sorry about that. Once the private sector has restored policing to proper functionality, and goes back to government, what about using the provincial and municipal governments to increase their roles? I strongly prefer keeping justice matters in government hands, and I don't see why we shouldn't include provincial and municipal governments where they've demonstrated competence to do it. The push for devolution of some policing powers to local government, of course, has been led by the DA in the Western Cape, where city and provincial government have been more effective in using the resources they've had as a general matter. But there are pockets of support among some local ANC officials to do the same. So there is some hope that Parliament will approve measures to devolve control of policing to provinces and towns. There are clearly advantages to having control of law enforcement by people well acquainted with local conditions. There's nothing in principle wrong with provincial and local branches of the state taking over some aspects of police. This is done successfully in countries like Canada, so why not? But the point is, we need to be proactive. If we leave it to get worse, you'll find people taking over by default, as is happening with the private sector at the moment. I'd much rather we planned our reform in advance and kept control of it. I'm going to stop in a minute, but I want to make a final point about austerity. As you know, government is talking about austerity, and we're cutting budgets for everything steadily. And so the question is, are we a poor country or are we a rich country? Well, the answer is we're not short of money. We're short of the good use of money. So we can't do things that are wasteful, like sending 100 security guards to Warsaw, or giving more money to the Blue Light Brigade than we give to the Hawks. But if we do that correctly, there's no reason why we don't have the money to do it. So obviously you've got to cut the funding of the Blue Light Brigade. There are very few countries that I know where we have such long retinues of very fancy cars, very expensive cars, driving ministers. I think obviously we need very strong protection for the president and I guess the deputy president. But we certainly don't need what we've got, and it encourages an elite pampering that I think is unhealthy for us in every possible way. So my final point is that we need to make hard choices and shift resources to where they're most needed, and that's the best way to fixing our crime system and our economy, so that taxes will go up and we'll have a bigger budget next year. Thank you. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, John. I mean, any hands? I don't see any hands. Please feel free to put them up. There are a couple comments. I'll come to those comments, and they are available in the chat. But I'll come to those and the people making them in a moment. I also see lots of interesting people, formidable, in the working in the cluster. So please feel free to comment and so on. But while I wait for someone to indicate that they have something to say, or I go to some of the comments, John, is this just not a kind of general feature of the shift that we have in the representative function? So there's a lot of misalignment, misallocation, inappropriate spending, contradictory policy mix, basic breakdowns of supervision, oversight, and so on. It's just not all a product of a failure of the representative function. That the representative institutions are not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not maintaining the vigilant oversight that they're not supposed to, so they're not directing the people to do what those things are. There's internal management breakdown within these portfolios or clusters, so within the SAPs, within the NPA, elsewhere. So you're right. Why is there so much expenditure on personnel? On the other hand, someone has to do the work. The problem is that the people who are hired or paid to ostensibly do this work are simply not doing the work. Maybe that's the problem. It's not the principle of paying those people. I mean, I don't know. It may be that they are top-heavy personnel, but
it's a bit of both, because and Ibrahim, the interesting thing is, throughout Africa after liberation, a similar thing happens. You get a focus on the elite. The elite and people in the cities tend to get better funded, and the people outside of that elite get less served. Now, I don't think liberation leaders come into power saying, this is what I'm going to do. But it comes about as a result of institutional factors. When you have people with the power, they tend to look after themselves. I mean, the Blue Light Brigade is such an obvious example of it. So until the public demands change, and people more and more start to put a spotlight on this and criticize the elite, I don't think it will change. And you know, your point, of course, staff need to be paid properly, but if you're paying people, when I was on the board of the SABC, I remember getting a graph that was really very meaningful. It showed how much salary increases people have been getting at the SABC for 20 years compared to the inflation rate, CPI. And steadily every year, the increase was far higher than the inflation rate. Well, that doesn't matter in the first year or two, but that graph I showed you reflects the fact that over a 20-year period, the effect of the compound interest is that they're getting there's too much going on personnel. I mean, many years ago, when I remember talking to Jackie Celebi when he was police commissioner, and he said, you know, police were terribly badly paid. And really, it was forcing them into corruption, and I believe that is true. But nowadays, a lot of people are paid a lot better, and you can't. Once you've got to a decent level, you have to rationalize. If our buildings, I mean, our appeal court has leaks in the roof. And there was one court case that they moved under a tree because the roof collapsed. That can't be right. It can't mean that it must mean that our priorities are not appropriate. I just think we might want to ask. I see Paul Hoffman has a question, which I think I know he could answer better than I could. So you may want to ask him to make his point.
Paul, can someone unmute Paul? Paul,
Yeah.
you're muted.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yes, no, I'm happy to add my tuppence worth, and thank you very much for giving up your Saturday morning for the education of the people willing to look at a small screen on a Saturday morning when everything that really happens in South Africa is in the afternoon on the rugby field rather than in a seminar of this nature. It's for the benefit of those who have not seen the book that John very kindly waved under your noses. That book, Under the Swinging Arch, is actually available for free as an electronic publication on the website of Accountability Now, which is accountabilitynow.org.za. So if you want to drill down a little further into the problems around the lack of capacity to deal with serious corruption in South Africa, then I think that your way is open if you simply download the book. It's a free service, compliments of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who put up the money to turn that manuscript into an electronic book. But the point at which I came in relation to how to restructure is because I think it's Rolf Pretorius. It was confusing the single prosecuting authority in South Africa with the police, which it's perfectly constitutional to organize the police at national, provincial, and local level. If you look at what Section 205 of the Constitution says, I think it's very clear that the police do not have the capacity at the moment to deal with serious corruption. If you look at the history of the Minister of Police and his involvement in those wonderful World Cup soccer leases for police headquarters, he ought not to be the head of the police. He ought to be one of their customers in the dock in a criminal trial. Now, once you've got a structure like that, it's very clear that the Hawks will not and cannot get to where they want to be as an effective and efficient anti-corruption investigative body. And I think that the government has realized that, which is why the IDAC bill, that is the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption envisages the location of the anti-corruption machinery in the National Prosecuting Authority, rather than splitting the investigative function off to the police and the prosecutorial function with our single prosecuting authority. Now, what you need to know about the suggested reform is that we're not trying to change everything overnight. What we have identified and what has been identified by the courts in the Glenister litigation is that serious corruption is rampant, it's out of control, and it is a scourge that threatens the future of South Africa. The stats, which are taken from official sources, and Johnny's quoted them already, show you that the Hawks are not functioning on the basis upon which the Scorpions functioned before them, and indeed their productivity has declined over the years. So the plan of the government is to take the investigative functions and transfer them to this rather Scorpions-like body, which is called IDAC, Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, located within the National Prosecuting Authority. Now, that isn't going to work. First of all, the Scorpions were closed down very easily because they were a creature of an ordinary statute that could be repealed by a simple majority. That is not what security of tenure is made of. That last S in STIRS is secure tenure of office. And you won't get secure tenure of office if you are in a body that is legislatively, operationally, and structurally indistinguishable from the Scorpions, because the first time a federal elite is in charge, it will simply close down in the same way as the Scorpions were closed down. So the idea of a Chapter 9 institution to do the heavy lifting on serious corruption and organized crime is that a specialized body to which you could attract the former Scorpions who've left the public service because of the bad experience they had there, could attract them back into the service, and you could use the best of the SIU, the best of the Hawks, and indeed the best of the prosecutors to transfer them into this elite body, which will simply be designed to go after serious corruption, which really threatens the future of South Africa more seriously than any other feature of the political scenario at the moment. So don't be confused by the tendency to elide various functions. The Hawks will not be closed down. The Hawks are actually quite good at child trafficking and rhino poaching and illicit diamond and gold buying. They just don't have the clout, what the HR theorists call the sapiential authority, to deal with a job that may involve looking into what is going on in high places in the country. For that, you need a Chapter 9 institution, because all of our Chapter 9 institutions have constitutionally entrenched and guaranteed independence, and best of all, they do not report to the executive branch of government at all. They report to Parliament, which is a multi-party body where everybody is checking their mates to see to it that proper oversight takes place. So the solution being proposed, and many of the opposition parties have taken up this suggestion, is that a Chapter 9 body should take over the investigation, the prosecution, the prevention, and the combating of serious corruption and organized crime. And that is really where the divide is at the moment. And one hopes that the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which promised us a report last month, It may have landed on the president's desk. It hasn't landed on my desk. If anybody in this meeting knows that it does exist, please send me a copy, because I'm interested to see what they say. Because if they remain true to the law and to the principles of the Constitution, as well as our international obligation to keep independent anti-corruption machinery going in South Africa, then they will come up with something that is the equivalent of, if not the same as, the suggestion we've been making since 2012. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. Oh, God. Thanks, Paul. I'm sure there's some responses to that, or people who want to reinforce a view or challenge a view. Feel free to do so. There's a couple other comments in the chat. Joan van Niekerk, please, if you don't mind. I mean, some interesting comments, and contrary to the spirit of what you've been saying, Paul is suggesting that the Hawks are actually quite good at some of these things. I know your point is largely about the SAPS and so on. But Joan, if you feel moved to want to say something, well, you'll be unmuted in a moment.
Thanks. Yes, I see Joan talks about the loss of skilled people, and I think that's right. But my fear is over the next 5 years, it'll get worse if we don't take action after this election, because we still have those people. I mean, as I say, I found some people in Greece. I'll spare them the embarrassment of mentioning them and limiting their future even further. But the fact is, we do have the expertise, but when you operate the way we are, you reduce it, as Paul described with the loss of the Scorpions. When I was in the United Nations in Afghanistan, we had quite a bunch of South Africans, security people working for the UN. Obviously, it's better paid and it has less frustration. So we have to value the people we have and use them for training. Otherwise, we will lose them. Joan, I see you there. Did you want to say something? You lost Abraham.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about the lack of access to justice for children. And what really bothers me is all this speak about children's rights and so on just doesn't translate into practice. We come across children in the child protection field whose cases have dragged on for 6, 7, 8 years. That's half a child's childhood. And when you think of the disruption to the lives of these children, and the fact that our offenses against children are extremely high in this country. When I go into international fora, I'm often asked about why is this? Why are crimes against children so high, particularly sexual crimes against children? And they're really not policed adequately. And I believe this is the reason. People are not held accountable for harming children, particularly, okay, we've got sexual violence against children, but physical violence against children is totally ignored. So children often reproduce what they experienced during childhood. If no justice, that translates into how they behave as adults. If no justice, it harms their development into the citizens, responsible citizenhood in this country. So I have a huge concern about this, our lack of care about access to justice for children.
Yes, thank you. You clearly have looked into this very deeply. I mean, but it's consistent, I think, with everything I've said. I see someone has just put in the question, what's the solution? what will be the solution to our country. The solution is we've got to implement the reforms we just discussed earlier. I'm not sure if the questioner was on through the morning, but if the problem is we're not prosecuting. Nothing else matters. Prosecuting and successfully prosecuting, investigating, trying, convicting, and sentencing. We don't do that. We don't do anything. We talk about other things. As I think, Joni, what you're referring to is, you have ministers attending marches. Well, they're marching against themselves. You either do the job and you're in government to do, or you don't. There aren't any third options. And these solutions are all there. We still have the people who can do it. We still have people who can do it. But we've got to respect them and find the people who are non-political and don't get involved in politics, and use them and protect them. Otherwise, it'll get worse. And of course, that depends on politics.
So it is a political problem, largely, and I don't want to pick on people, but the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly I see is amongst us when I cast my eye over the participants list, and maybe the Deputy Speaker will want to defend the political class that the Deputy Speaker generally presides over sometimes in the National Assembly. So Deputy Speaker, if you want to, Mr. Lechesa Tsenoli, but here you don't get to make the rules. We make the rules here in this instance. But there's a bunch of other people who work in the sector. I mean, Lizette, David, Neil, there's a whole bunch of people. I'm sure you have some responses to partly what John is saying, but also what Paul was proposing in terms of a shift to making something like the Scorpions a Chapter 9 institution in the Constitution. But anyway, anyone else? And if there isn't, Rolf Pretorius has had a couple comments, some of them disparate, but and Paul's responded to some of them, but you perhaps want to say something, Rolf?
It's muted.
Mute, okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to engage with Paul Hoffman, because he's in what I see in section 199(1) of the Constitution. There it still says that the security services of the Republic consists out of a single police service. So now I don't know how the different clauses of the Constitution works with each other. According to me, if one wants to decentralize the police into 9 provincial police forces, then that clause will have to change in some way.
I don't think he was suggesting that you'd completely decentralize it, but you can allocate certain powers to local level. Do you want to unmute Paul?
And that's right. There's quite a few, well, fairly reasonably extensive powers devolved provincially, especially for oversight, as far as I'm aware. But Paul, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. Rolf, the story is with section 199 that at the time that the Constitution was being put together, there were police forces, not services, but police forces in all of the former homelands, the independent homelands, and of course in the rump of South Africa as well. So what they were stressing at that point in section 199 is that we're not going to keep different police services in all of the component parts of South Africa. And then when they got to section 205, they explained that the way that the police can be organized would be at national, provincial, and where appropriate, which is an interesting way of putting it, at the local level as well. So you can have a local level police service where it is appropriate, but you're entitled to have a provincial police service, and that's going to become very interesting if certain provinces, besides the Western Cape, fall into hands that are not the hands of the alliance which governs at national level at the moment. So that is the distinction. Even with the idea of a single prosecution service, there was a case called Potsani's case, which you can look up on Google. Potsane. Potsani's case was about a military court which had disciplined an officer in the military, and he took the point that the military court had no standing at all, and that he ought not to have been prosecuted by somebody who was not a member of the National Prosecuting Authority. And he got short shrift from the courts, really on the same basis, that when they talk about a single prosecution service, it meant that there won't be separate silos in all of the component parts of the new South Africa. I hope that explains it for you.
Thank you.
Also, what I've seen otherwise in another place in the Constitution also is that it says that the police will fall under the National Commissioner of Police. Now, what I'm thinking of is that the police be completely decentralized as far as the precincts are concerned, at least. And it seems to me that is not provided for by the Constitution. Or do you think that to do that is going to be impractical?
No, look, there are already municipal police in the big metros. They are organized at local level. They have a limited function. They don't go after all of the big fish. They look after things at local level, and that's being allowed. So I don't think there will be a problem with limited decentralization, because the Constitution envisages police being organized at national, provincial, and where appropriate, local level.
Thanks, Paul. I've got two people on my list. I'm going to ask Mondli Mabuza in a moment. He's made a proposal in the chat, somewhat controversial, interesting, but controversial. It's been made before, but we'll come to that. David, I'll let David Bruce come in. David.
Hi, Ibrahim. Hi, John, and hi, everyone. So thank you for the discussion, and thanks, John, for trying to look at this kind of issue of, the broad criminal justice system and have a shot at looking at it from a big picture view. Yeah, I think you've raised a hell of a lot that thought-provoking and potentially useful. I just want to, and so there's a lot that I could try and engage with. A lot of it doesn't lend itself to easy answers, but maybe I'm going to try and limit myself to just kind of two basic kind of points. The one thing is that I don't think that we quite understanding the Constitution here. So the Constitution says, Section 205(1), is it? Yeah, 205(1) says the national service shall or may be structured to function at the national, provincial, and where appropriate local level. That's the one thing. So we're talking about what we need to bring into our discussion is a concept of a hybrid policing system. It's not either centralized or decentralized, as is the case in many other parts of the world. There's elements of central power, and there's elements of decentralization and so on. And it's about how one balances those two. The other thing is that if one reads the Constitution carefully, Chapter 11, what it says refers repeatedly to is national legislation. So there's enormous scope for national legislation to be used to shape this how the policing system operates. So the one possibility would be some kind of consolidation of power. I would argue that it should be done selectively, or so for instance, if we look at the current legislative provisions related to municipal police service, they don't generally authorize municipalities to establish municipal police services. They authorize them to establish them under certain circumstances or conditions. And similarly, if we were to restructure and make some provision for decentralized control over the SAPS, which would have to remain the National Police Service. But if we were to make some kind of greater provision for instance, metropolitan governments to have greater authority relating to the functioning of the SAPS within their area of jurisdiction, potentially that would be something that would happen selectively rather than across the board. So then, and there's a broader conversation that can be had there. The second thing is I heard Joan talking about the victimization of children and the negligent, the failure of our criminal justice system to respond effectively to that problem. Other people have highlighted the problem of corruption and so on. And just, the basic question that I would make is this question about, I think GBV at least got at least a passing mention in one or two comments, but we also have a very high murder rate. We've currently got murder sitting at something like 27,000 murders a year. And, there isn't any legitimate system of prioritization in South, of types of crime in South Africa that can validly exclude murder from it. And so, if we're looking at our political leadership of the police and the criminal justice system, the first level on which they are failing is in providing a coherent set of priorities for the criminal justice system. And so you'll get these things like, to a very large degree, the way in which things are operating is simply to rehash old frameworks and everything. So, for instance, the concept of contact crime and reducing contact crime is rehashed as it has been done for 20 years or more. So, maybe I should just stop there. But maybe just one other point is that I would just exercise a bit of caution. I think what I would say is that on this issue of kind of our response to corruption, I am not the issue of a Chapter 9 institution. I'm not convinced by it. I don't see, if one looks at our existing Chapter 9 institutions, what is the evidence there that those institutions, establishing new institutions, is going to, be this kind of magic bullet for the problem of corruption? And so, at least kind of personally, my orientation is still very much towards an emphasis on strengthening our existing institutions. The reasons why our institutions are failing is not exclusively about whether they are independent or not. It is, we need to ask the hard questions about why they are not, providing us with the kinds of services that they need to serve. We need to be open to creative and innovative ways about thinking about the current reality in which we are, which prevails. And maybe I'll just stop there. Thank you.
David, I want to press you. I'm sorry. I want to press you for one short thing. And it's a small answer to your own question. What do you think it is that's holding us back from some of the obvious solutions we know, and those which we might not know but need to think creatively about? Just a short, what do you think can be done in the short term, if anything?
Well, you see, I mean, I think, you know, as John highlighted, the problems are complex. But I mean, if I'm looking at the policing space, you know, the basic question is that, you know, at one level, the basic problem is that we have not had a government which has provided coherent political leadership to the police for at least, you know, since at least 1990. The issue of having a minister who is properly engaged with questions of policing policy, having a machinery for, you know, that helps government to understand you know, the critical issues in the policing space, and you know, helping government to kind of think about it and put in place coherent policies. That simply hasn't happened. So, I mean, you know, question number one for me is government able, or are we able to elect a government, or what, you know, however you want to frame it, that can in fact put in place an effective system of governance over the police? Because the Constitution provides, you know, what is it, 2061 and 2062, it gives a central role to the national policing policy. And basically, you know, that provision is a provision that has been systematically neglected. So these questions to do, for instance, with decentralization and things like that, they're being addressed by default. Gauteng has just gone ahead and established its own police force. And, you know, in some ways one can't blame them, because national government has not been providing the kind of leadership that it needs to provide.
Thanks, David. So if we are returning to the question of politics and government and the relationship between politics and government. And so it's some of the, not institutional features, but the institutional features of representation. Those oversight bodies, those oversight institutions are not doing what they are meant to do to get the thing to work. You may have a response to this, but Montley, if you're keen, you can make your point. I think everyone can see in the chat, but you may want to explain a bit what you mean, that, you know, there was proposals that the military, and I think in some cases they did, were sent to parts of the Western Cape and the city of Cape Town to deal with the scourge of gangsterism and so on. But you're making a proposal that it be wider and that they be involved in policing. I know David has some very firm ideas about that, but I'll let you come in first.
Okay, my point that I'd like to make is that the military should be involved. Yes, they were deployed, but it's something that should be much more nationally, I mean, much more wider, as you've indicated. Because some of the crimes, yes, the Constitution does say that they should be involved in national crisis that they should tackle. But there are some incidences that happens, like take for instance the moment that happened whereby the music video shooters were gang raped, and 68 people from the foreign nationals were involved there as well. So I feel like the military should be more involved, deploy all over the areas, because even their visibility in the high crime areas like Johannesburg, some of the major cities that are also affected by crime rates and also the death rates as well. So military should be involved instead of them being kept there at the military bases and deployed occasionally. They should be deployed more regularly, like it should be an everyday kind of thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Montley. I know there are people here who will partly disagree, but many would disagree because they would believe the orientation of the military is fundamentally different and that they aren't able to conduct a sort of civilian role in terms of policing and so on. But I mean, it's a point, it's a good point, and up for debate, but so it's out there. If anyone wants to respond, John, do you?
Yes, sure. I mean, I understand why Mondli is suggesting it, because we're not getting things done under current circumstances. The police isn't delivering. But if you go back to the webinar we did on the Defence Force, what you find is that its ability to do the work it's supposed to do in the DRC, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is under real threat because budgets, the Defence Force have been cut very substantially. And and so it's not clear that they can necessarily do the job. But also, I mean, I have a sort of a conceptual problem with that too, because the point of my talk was that you either fix what's broken or you don't. What's broken is the police force. You either fix the police force or the problems continue. So that's my concern, that we don't. We have a fundamental problem, and it's like the other problems. Don't suggest something else. We have to fix police. We have to fix the NPA. We can use private sector support, but we can't avoid it. But we have to see where is the problem, what is it supposed to be done, why isn't it being done, and solve it. And the trouble with the military is, as you say, Abraham, they don't have the right skills necessarily, but also it's covering up for the problem rather than fixing it.
No, absolutely. I mean, interesting proposal about the private sector, and everyone wants the private sector, and of course they encourage that the private sector should contribute, not just through the formal public-private partnerships, PPPs, and so on, but like a general sort of social commitment to upskilling and dealing with logistics and that, dealing with a whole bunch of other management and administrative issues. But isn't there a danger, John, that sometimes, and at least in some of the sensitive things, the private sector, who, as the Zondo Commission has shown, has themselves been prone to corruption, are not going to use this not as a Trojan horse, but as a leveraging point to come in and use the kind of idea of assistance as a proxy to pursue their own interests?
Well, thank you, everyone. I mean, that's why I think it's not a long-term solution. And the point is, we've taken in the private sector out of government weakness, not strength. It's not because we decided, oh, the private sector is the best place to do policing. We've done it because the problem is that policing is just failing. But as I say, I don't have the same view about members of the legal system. Lawyers have offered to do the job, and I think that offer should be taken, because they're not coming in. They fall under the direction of the government, of the National Prosecuting Authority in this case, but they would just come with a specific brief. I think if you're giving the private sector a specific brief that is determined by the government, by the official sources, that's the way it works. Now, I just saw Marjorie said that her guess is that her experience of the Chapter 9 bodies, they don't work. Well, I was in the very first Chapter 9 body, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, that got into trouble with corruption. And I saw what happened there. I wrote about my first book on Spies and Lies. And the problem is, and it goes back to the other thing we raised a few episodes ago, which is that as long as you have the proportional representation system, the MPs derive their power, their position, their legitimacy from the party, not from voters. And as long as that is the case, I think you're going to have that problem with the private sector, with the Chapter 9 bodies. When we had corruption in the IBA, it was the very first case of it under the democratic system. And the problem was that the ANC moved in, the government people, both the minister and the parliamentary committee people, and gave them a certain level of protection and took control of the situation. And that, I think, is a real violation of the spirit of the Constitution, where the Chapter 9 bodies are supposed to be independent of the state and answerable to the legislature. But the way we have it now, the legislature isn't really acting independently.
I do want to give Marjorie an opportunity to say something because she's made a second comment, but the spirit of the first one is not so much, and partly it is operational, John, but it's a design flaw, as Marjorie is saying. There's a conceptual problem in the way in which this thing has been established. Marjorie, if you're able to unmute yourself and just come in briefly if you can. No, either Marjorie is struggling to unmute or thinks a point. Marjorie?
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you,
There we
Ephraim. There are very, very problematic flaws in the design of these commissions, where you have the board, the so-called body of commissioners who have been, I was on in 2 terms of office, and the first commission was selected by an incredibly wonderful, wide-ranging panel of interviewers. The second panel was only political, I wanted to say sycophants, and it was appalling what happened with that selection. And so no, I think there's a fundamental problem that needs to be attended if we are really going to make these Chapter 9 institutions function the way they should. That's really all I wanted to say, and I don't know how to do that except to remove all the political interference that goes on.
Thank you.
That's probably never going to happen. But I mean, and I think it is partly undesirable to think that we can divorce politics from everything and insulate it. But we do need basically a better class of politician, because I mean, on paper, theoretically, the appointment of people in Chapter 9s and so on is it seems fairly open and transparent. Public nominations, interviews. We know that the politicians play sometimes often a very counterproductive role. But I'm not going to make any pronouncements on that. Paul, I think you wanted to say something before I leave John to round up. And I did suggest that more than one comment was made about the intersection of politics, bad politics, leading to bad government. And I don't want to pick on the Deputy Speaker, but if they perhaps want to say something briefly, we'll allow that. But before that, Paul, and then John to round up. And if Lechesa has something to say, I'll provide that opportunity. It's Paul?
Yes, thanks. Just to deal with Marjorie's point while it's still fresh in the group's mind, let's remember that Tuli Madonsela was a proper Chapter 9 institution head, and if it wasn't for her intervention in relation to state capture, we wouldn't have had the Zondo Commission at all. The Auditor General has done its job properly, and we do know, because the Auditor General does its job properly, what the extent of the looting in the public administration has been. I agree with Marjorie that once you politicize the appointment procedures, you're on a hiding to nothing, especially when the cadre deployment policy is the order of the day in the eyes of the ANC. But may I, because she doesn't know the answer, simply refer her and everybody else interested to the minority judgment of Edwin Cameron, who featured in John's introductory remarks in the third Glenister case. He is concerned that the appointment procedures should be freed of political bias, and he suggests ways in which to do it. And I think that that is, in fact, the answer to the question that Marjorie raises. And at the end of the day, corruption is at the core. What is wrong with the police is that they are corrupt. What is wrong with the public administration is that there is too much corruption in too many places. If we don't address corruption in high places, we are going to become a failed state. The law is very clear. We have treaty obligations left, right, and center that at AU level, at UN level, at SADC level, that oblige us to keep independent anti-corruption machinery. We don't have any at the moment. That has been litigated, and the court has come up with the STIRS criteria. The STIRS criteria are binding and ought to be put in place. We don't do those things, then we don't comply with our treaty obligations. We don't put our STIRS criteria in place. We are really staring failure in the face. So, it may be difficult, and it may not be palatable to too many people who lack the political will to do what is right, but it is something that needs to be done. Thanks so much for being generous with your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks. One short quip is, of course, we would not have had the Zondo Commission if Thuli Madonsela was not the public protector. But there's an argument which says that had Parliament played its actual role, you may not have needed the Zondo Commission, and the public protector could have focused on other instances of maladministration and malpractice. And malfeasance, and Parliament properly should have done that. In fact, there's an argument which says that the Nkandla matter would not have gone to the Constitutional Court had Parliament actually played its role. So there's real questions about political and governance failure. Hence my opening remarks about the representative interface, particularly of oversight and representation, which is starting to break down or has broken down. John, over to you. Final remarks.
Yes, thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for listening and for your contributions. I smiled when Marjorie said her experience of the Chapter 9 was the first time round. She had a wonderful interview panel that all went well and very professional. And then the second time round, it had become overly politicized and became hopeless. My experience was exactly the same. I was interviewed the first time at CODESA by a wide-ranging panel. Nobody had, I mean, there were politicians included, but they didn't have the political agenda they later required. And it was a wonderful experience. And after that, it changed completely. I want to say a couple of things about our system versus others and what's the perfect system. First of all, there's no perfect system. I've looked at cases, look at the US and the UK where abuses are getting worse at the moment. But there are various things that can be done. And the first is, why did was Parliament so ineffective? And a major reason was the proportional representation system. Because if you're elected by proportional representation, you're accountable to essentially the leader of the party, the leadership of the party, not to constituents. Now, constituents in a constituency system, whether it's the UK, US, it's not perfect, and they're obviously subject to a level of party discipline, but they also know that they can be voted out by their constituents. And so there's a countervailing pressure that's important. And so I would think, I see Rolf has made this point too, and that's why we proposed, something on the lines of the Slavitt Commission, where you have a combination of, you don't lose proportionality, but you do gain constituency level support. So even if you have a constituency of 3 or 5 MPs, that gives you the proportionality you want. But it also means that if you behave badly or don't act against the constituents' interests, they will vote you out next time, or you at least have that risk. The other thing I wanted to say, I've looked at this whole issue of independent institutions, especially in places like Washington, where I'm quite a bit. And Again, it's not a perfect system. In my equivalent, the Federal Communications Commission was the equivalent of the body I was on. And the protection is a couple of things. The most important protection is if you have a system that appoints people who are professionals in their field, they have a reputation to defend. And that actually is a crucial factor that they know that if they do the wrong thing, their reputations in their field will be hurt. So if you're a lawyer or a journalist or some other kind of person that is going to go back to your field and needs to be respected in the field, that acts as an important break. So as I say, there's no perfect system, but we can do a lot to improve it. And I think we have an institutional problem with Parliament. Parliament won't act predominantly in the public interest while you have a PR system where effectively the people choosing the MPs are strongly influenced by the leadership of the party. Now, that's it. Thanks everyone for listening, and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks. Thanks, John. If there are any final comments, I'll allow that for a moment, but we are on 10:36. We generally do end by 11:36, sorry. We generally do end and at this time. So if there aren't any further comments, I'm going to thank DOD for hosting and stimulating this series that's been going on. All of the recordings are available online. They're all fairly extensive and they cover a wide range of topics. Especially would recommend the ones which look at the proposals for rapid creation of jobs and so on, and policy reforms regarding that. So thanks, John, for the series. Thanks for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Without you, these wouldn't be a success. And we will see you at the next one. Keep a lookout for the next series. It will be advertised and probably will be in 2 weeks' time. So thanks, everyone, and thanks for attending. Thanks for your inputs. Thanks for the discussion. See you soon.
Thank you.